The thunder rolled across Millfield like a warning, but it came too late. By dawn, the century-old oak that had stood sentinel at the edge of Harmon Park lay vanquished, its massive root system exposed like veins torn from the earth. Groundskeeper Walter Simmons noticed it first. Something unnatural caught among the tangled roots. Not rock, not soil. Something that glinted dully in the morning light. Walter's trembling fingers brushed away mud to reveal carved symbols on what appeared to be metal, ancient yet somehow preserved. He called the university immediately. Within hours, Dr. Eleanor Reed and her team arrived, their expressions shifting from professional curiosity to stunned silence as they carefully extracted what had been hidden beneath the oak for generations. The local historical society had no records of anything significant in this location. No one did. What had been buried beneath this ordinary tree, and why would someone have gone to such lengths to conceal it? Walter Simmons paced the perimeter of the fallen oak, checking his watch every few minutes. The university was only 30 miles away, but the morning traffic would slow them down. He had covered the strange metal object with a tarp to protect it from the lingering drizzle. The archaeological team arrived in 2 vehicles. A university van loaded with equipment and Dr. Eleanor Reed's personal Subaru. She approached with quick, purposeful strides, her rain jacket zipped to her chin. "Mr. Simmons, I'm Dr. Reed. Show me what you found." Walter lifted the tarp, revealing the tangle of roots and the object nestled within them. Dr. Reed crouched beside it, her expression cautious, but her eyes alight with curiosity. "Interesting," she murmured, pulling a small brush from her pocket. "It appears to be deliberately placed among the roots, not just caught there by chance." Her team unloaded equipment, setting up a small tent over the site. The rain had stopped, but dark clouds threatened more to come. "We need to document everything exactly as it is before moving anything," Dr. Reed explained. She photographed the scene from multiple angles, while her assistant sketched the position of the object relative to the tree roots, using gentle strokes. Dr. Reed cleaned away some of the dirt. "These markings, they're deliberate, not natural. Formations in the metal." Walter leaned closer. "What do you think it is?" "Too early to say, but it's definitely old. The way the roots have grown around, it suggests it's been here for decades, possibly longer." After an hour of careful documentation, Dr. Reed made her decision. "We need to extract it carefully. The university lab will have better tools for cleaning and preservation." The removal process was painstaking. 2 graduate students carefully cut away smaller roots, while Dr. Reed monitored to ensure the object remained undamaged. By mid-afternoon, they had freed it enough to see its full shape. A rectangular metal container, roughly the size of a shoebox, covered in symbols that resembled no alphabet, Walter recognized. "Is it valuable?" Walter asked. Dr. Reed stood, stretching her back after hours of crouching. "Historically, potentially very. Monetarily, that's not why we do this work, Mr. Simmons." As they prepared to transport the object to the university, Dr. Reed handed Walter her card. "You did the right thing calling us. Most people would have just pulled it out, possibly damaging it or its contents." "Contents?" Walter asked. Dr. Reed nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's sealed. Whatever someone hid under this tree is still waiting to be discovered." The university laboratory buzzed with quiet excitement. Dr. Reed had cleared her schedule for the week, focusing entirely on the mysterious metal container. Under bright lights and with specialized tools, she and her team worked methodically to clean years of soil from the surface without damaging the intricate markings. "The metal composition is unusual," said Dr. Hargrove, the materials specialist. He examined the results of the initial tests. "High copper content, but with traces of elements we don't typically see in colonial-era metallurgy." Dr. Reed nodded, photographing a section of symbols she had just revealed. "These markings are fascinating. Some resemble Algonquian pictographs, but others ... I've never seen anything like them. After 3 days of careful cleaning and documentation, the full exterior of the box was visible. Approximately 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 6 inches deep, it was sealed with what appeared to be an ancient locking mechanism. We need to date it before attempting to open it, Dr. Reed insisted, and we should run scans to see what might be inside. The dating process provided their first surprise. Carbon dating of organic material found embedded in the corrosion suggested the box had been in the ground for at least 300 years, possibly longer. That predates European settlement in this specific area, Dr. Reed told her team during their morning briefing. The official records show the first permanent settlement in Millfield was established in 1749. The X-ray scans revealed shadowy shapes inside the container. Several small objects of varying density, including what appeared to be a rolled ore. Folded material, possibly paper or parchment. If there really is paper in there that survived all this time, it must have been sealed incredibly well, said Tara Wong, a graduate student specializing in document preservation. Dr. Reed studied the X-ray images. We need to be extremely careful with the opening. If there is written material inside, exposure to air after all this time could damage it irreparably. She made several calls that afternoon, consulting with conservation specialists from major museums. By evening, she had developed a plan. We'll create a controlled environment for the opening, she explained to Walter Simmons, who had stopped by for an update. Specific humidity and temperature, specialized lighting, and tools designed for minimal impact. Walter stared at the cleaned artifact, now resting in a custom-built support. It's beautiful in its way, indeed, Dr. Reed agreed. But its real value lies in what it can tell us. Before we proceed further, I want to learn more about the location where you found it. The history of that park, the oak tree itself. Context matters tremendously in archaeology. Walter nodded. The Millfield Historical Society might have records. The park was named after the Harmon family. They were among the town founders, from what I've heard. Perfect, Dr. Reed said. Let's see what we can learn about the Harmons and their connection to that specific piece of land. The Millfield Historical Society occupied a Victorian house on Maple Street, its rooms converted into exhibition spaces and archives. Martha Delaney, the Society's president for 20 years, welcomed Dr. Reed and Walter with enthusiasm. An archaeological find in Harmon Park? How fascinating. She led them to a room filled with filing cabinets and bookshelves. We have extensive records of the town's development, though they get sparser the further back you go. Dr. Reed explained what they were looking for, and Martha pulled several folders from the cabinets. The Harmon family donated that land to the town in 1892, she explained, spreading out yellow documents on a large table. Before that, it was part of their estate. They were lumber merchants, quite wealthy by local standards. Walter pointed to a faded photograph showing the oak tree, much smaller but recognizable. That must be from when the park was first established. Indeed, Martha confirmed. The Harmons specifically requested that the oak be preserved when they donated the land. It was already a substantial tree even then. Dr. Reed studied the property maps. What about before the Harmons? Who owned that land originally? Martha frowned slightly. That gets tricky. Official town records only go back to incorporation in 1749. Before that, everything is quite fragmentary. She pulled out an older, leather-bound volume. This contains some pre-incorporation accounts, mostly, from church records and personal journals. They spent hours poring over the materials. The land that became Millfield had been part of a larger territory claimed by European settlers in the early 18th century. But specific details about individual properties were scarce. Wait, Walter said, pointing to a name in a faded entry. Harmon appears here in 1732, That's earlier than I expected. Martha adjusted her reading glasses. Yes, Thomas Harmon? He wasn't among the first wave of settlers, but he arrived within a decade of establishment. It says he purchased land from a Jacob Wilson. Does it specify which tract of land? Dr. Reed asked. Martha shook her head. Not precisely. Property boundaries were quite fluid then. As they were preparing to leave, an elderly man entered the Historical Society, walking slowly with a cane. That's Herbert Wilson, Martha whispered. His family has been here as long as anyone. 92 years old and sharp as a tack. When Martha mentioned their research, Herbert's eyes brightened. The old oak in Harmon Park? There were always stories about that tree. What kind of stories? Dr. Reed asked. Herbert settled into a chair. My grandfather used to say the Harmons protected that oak because it marked something important, a secret of some kind. Children weren't supposed to play near it, he chuckled. Naturally, that made it irresistible to us as boys. Did you ever find anything unusual there? Walter asked. No, nothing. But my grandfather insisted there was something special about it. He said it was older than the town itself. Herbert paused. The Harmons and the Wilsons didn't get along, historically speaking, some old dispute that never quite healed. As they left, Dr. Reed made notes on her phone. We need to look into this Wilson-Harmon connection. And the fact that the oak was specifically protected in the land donation is significant. Walter nodded. Looks like your artifact might be connected to some local family drama. Often the most interesting historical discoveries are, Dr. Reed replied. Personal stories that never made it into the official records. Back at the university laboratory, preparations for opening the metal container were underway. Dr. Reed had assembled a small team of specialists. Tara Wong for document preservation, Dr. Hargrove for materials analysis, and a visiting expert in colonial artifacts, Professor James Chun. The environmental chamber is ready, Tara reported. We can maintain optimal humidity and temperature to minimize degradation once the box is opened. Dr. Reed nodded, reviewing the detailed scans they had taken. These CT images give us a better idea of what we're dealing with. There appear to be several distinct objects inside, including what might be a small book or bundle of papers. Professor Chun studied the lock mechanism. Fascinating design. Not European in origin, despite the time period. It shows influences from indigenous craftsmanship, but with unusual modifications. They decided to conduct one final series of tests before attempting to open the container. Soil samples from within the root system were analyzed, confirming that the box had remained undisturbed for centuries. The pollen analysis from the surrounding soil gives us additional dating confirmation, Dr. Hargrove explained. The deepest layer containing traces of the box dates to approximately the early 1700s. Consistent with our other findings, Dr. Reed made detailed notes. That aligns with what we learned at the Historical Society. The timing corresponds with early settlement in the region, including the arrival of the Harmon family. The team gathered around the examination table, where the container rested in its custom support. Professor Chun pointed to specific symbols on the lid. These markings combine elements from at least 2 different systems of writing, he explained. Some resemble Algonquian symbols, while others have European characteristics. It suggests a cultural blending that was rare for that time period. After documenting every detail, they prepared for the opening. The container was carefully transferred to the environmental chamber, which was sealed except for specially designed glove ports that allowed them to manipulate objects inside without exposing them to uncontrolled air. I'll attempt to release. The locking mechanism, Professor Chun said, inserting his hands into the gloves. With delicate precision, he applied gentle pressure to different parts of the lock, looking for the release point. After 20 minutes of careful manipulation, there was a faint click. The team held their breath as Professor Chun slowly lifted the lid. It's intact, he whispered, as they crowded around the viewing panel. The contents appear remarkably well preserved. Inside the box lay several objects. A small leather pouch, what appeared to be carved wooden items, a metal implement of unknown purpose, and most promising of all, a folded parchment packet sealed with wax. "Extraordinary preservation," Tara murmured. "The seal must have been remarkably effective at keeping out moisture." Dr. Reed photographed the contents in situ before they proceeded. "We'll document and remove each item individually, starting with the non-paper artifacts." As Professor Chun carefully lifted out the leather pouch, Dr. Reed felt a growing sense that they had stumbled upon something far more significant than a mere historical curiosity. This was a deliberate time capsule, hidden centuries ago beneath what was then a young oak tree, waiting to be discovered. The team worked in reverent silence, methodically removing and cataloging each item from the metal container. The leather pouch contained small, polished stones with faint markings. The wooden items proved to be intricately carved game pieces, similar to chess, but with unfamiliar shapes. The metal implement resembled a compass, but with additional markings along its circumference. "These items show remarkable craftsmanship," Professor Chun noted, examining one of the game pieces under magnification. "The carving technique suggests European tools, but the imagery is distinctly indigenous." Dr. Reed nodded, but her attention remained fixed on the folded parchment packet. It represented the most fragile item, and potentially the most informative. "Tara, are we ready for the document?" she asked. Tara adjusted the humidity controls slightly. "Yes, the conditions are optimal for minimal degradation upon exposure." Using specialized tools, Tara carefully broke the wax seal. Age had made this parchment brittle, requiring extreme delicacy as she unfolded it. The team watched through the viewing panel, holding their breath collectively as the document slowly revealed its contents. "It's handwritten," Dr. Reed observed. "The script appears to be 18th century English, but there are other markings interspersed throughout." As the final fold was opened, they could see that the parchment contained dense writing covering both sides, along with several small diagrams and symbols in the margins. "I can make out a date," Professor Chun said, pointing carefully. 1731. "No, 1734. Dr. Reed leaned closer to the viewing panel. "The handwriting is quite legible, considering its age. It begins with I, Thomas Harmon. Commit these words to record the truth of events which have transpired. Single quotes. Harmon," Walter exclaimed. "The same family that owned the land." Dr. Reed continued reading fragments aloud. Single quotes. Alliance with the people of the WANASPI. Single quotes. Items of sacred importance to both our peoples. Single quotes. Single quotes. Agreement must remain hidden from those who would destroy it. Single quote. She paused, scanning further down the document. Her expression shifted from academic interest to genuine surprise. "This appears to be a personal account of some kind of treaty or agreement between Thomas Harmon and a local indigenous group not widely documented in colonial records," she said. "The Wanaspi aren't mentioned in most historical accounts of this region." Professor Chun was examining one of the diagrams on the parchment. "This looks like a map of local waterways, but with additional markings that might indicate settlements or significant locations. What's most remarkable," Dr. Reed said, continuing to scan the document, "is that this appears to be a record of cooperation rather than conflict. And based on the date, it predates the official settlement records for this area." Walter watched through the viewing panel, fascinated by the team's careful work. Why would someone bury a record like this? Dr. Reed looked up, her eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. "That's exactly the right question. According to this text, Thomas Harmon had reasons to keep this agreement secret from certain authorities or other settlers. He writes about ensuring mutual protection through mutual silence. We'll need to translate the entire document carefully, Tara said, already preparing the specialized equipment for high resolution photography of each section of the parchment. Dr. Reed nodded. This will take time to properly analyze. But one thing is already clear. This discovery challenges the established narrative about early settler and indigenous relations in this specific area. The following days were consumed by careful translation and analysis of the parchment document. Dr. Reed brought in Dr. Lily Blackwood, a linguistic anthropologist specializing in colonial-era texts and indigenous languages. The document switches between English and another language, Dr. Blackwood explained, studying the high-resolution images. The non-English portions appear to be a variant of an Algonquian language, but with unique characteristics I haven't encountered before. Dr. Reed's team had set up a dedicated workspace for the translation effort, with multiple computer screens displaying different sections of the text alongside reference materials. Thomas Harmon writes with remarkable clarity about his encounters with the Wanaspi people, Dr. Blackwood continued. He describes them as a small band that had separated from a larger tribal group following conflicts with early European settlers. Walter, who had been invited to observe the process, listened intently. So they were refugees of a sort? In modern terms, yes, Dr. Blackwood nodded. Harmon writes that he encountered their settlement while exploring land he had recently purchased. Rather than reporting their presence to colonial authorities, he initiated peaceful contact. As the translation progressed, a remarkable story emerged. Thomas Harmon, unlike many of his contemporaries, had established a mutually beneficial relationship with the Wanaspi. He provided them protection by keeping their location secret, while they shared knowledge of local plants, waterways, and survival techniques. This section describes a severe illness that struck Harmon's family. Dr. Blackwood pointed to a passage. He credits the Wanaspi healer with saving his wife and children when colonial medicine had failed. Dr. Reed was documenting connections between the text and the other artifacts from the box. The carved game pieces appear to be mentioned here. They were a gift from the Wanaspi leader to Harmon's children, described as pieces for learning the movement of spirits through the world. The most significant revelation, Dr. Blackwood said, focusing on a dense section of text, is this description of a formal agreement. Harmon and the Wanaspi leader created a pact that allowed the indigenous group to remain on a portion of Harmon's land in exchange for certain considerations. Walter leaned forward. What kind of considerations? Primarily knowledge exchange, Dr. Blackwood replied, but also a form of mutual defense. The document suggests other settlers were encroaching on the area, some with hostile intent toward both Harmon and any indigenous people. Dr. Reed carefully examined the diagrams on the parchment. These markings show boundaries. This appears to be a land-sharing arrangement, unofficially deeding a portion of Harmon's legal claim to the Wanaspi, which would have been illegal under colonial law, Professor Chon added, hence the secrecy. The final paragraphs of the document proved most illuminating. Harmon wrote of his decision to create a permanent record of the agreement, hidden where only his descendants would know to look. The oak sapling marks the center point where our lands join, Dr. Blackwood read aloud. Into its growing roots, I commit this testament and these tokens of our bond to remain until such time as our peoples can openly acknowledge their shared history. Dr. Reed sat back in her chair. He deliberately buried this box under a young oak tree, expecting it to remain hidden for generations. And it did, Walter said quietly, for nearly 300 years. With the parchment's translation providing context, the team turned their attention to the other objects from the metal container. Each item was carefully examined, photographed, and analyzed in the controlled environment chamber. The leather pouch contains 7 polished stones, Dr. Hargrove reported. Each bears carved symbols that correspond to markings on the parchment. Dr. Reed consulted the translation notes. According to Harmon's account, these were used in Wanaspi ceremonies to represent the 7 core values of their community: wisdom, courage, respect, honesty, humility, love, and truth. Tara was examining the compass-like object. "This is fascinating. It's definitely European in basic design, but it's been modified. These additional markings align with seasonal indicators mentioned in the text. A blending of European and indigenous technologies," Professor Chon observed. Harmon writes that it was his contribution to their shared knowledge, modified with Wanaspi astronomical understanding. The carved wooden pieces proved particularly significant. There were 16 in total, each representing a different animal or natural element. Dr. Blackwood identified them as pieces for a Wanaspi game that taught children about ecological relationships. "These aren't just game pieces," she explained. "They're teaching tools. The markings and shapes represent a sophisticated understanding of local wildlife and their interdependence." Walter carefully studied the images of each piece. "They're beautiful. The craftsmanship is remarkable. What's most interesting," Dr. Reed said, "is how these objects demonstrate cultural exchange rather than dominance." Harmon adopted elements of Wanaspi knowledge while sharing European techniques. The final item from the container was smaller than the others and had been nestled in a specially padded compartment, a silver pendant on a leather cord, bearing markings from both cultures. "This is mentioned specifically in the text," Dr. Blackwood sighed, consulting her notes. "It was created jointly by Harmon and the Wanaspi leader as a physical symbol of their agreement. Harmon describes it as a token that the bearer speaks for both peoples." Dr. Reed examined the pendant's detailed imagery. The craftsmanship suggests it was meant to be worn openly, yet the text indicates it needed to be hidden. That contradiction speaks volumes about the tensions of that era. "Could it have been used as identification?" Walter asked. "To safely identify friendlies from both groups?" Professor Chon nodded. "That's a reasonable interpretation. A subtle signal that would be recognized by those who knew, but wouldn't attract unwanted attention from outsiders." Dr. Hargrove had completed the metallurgical analysis of the pendant. "The silver is of European origin, but the design technique shows indigenous influence. Truly a hybrid object." As they documented each artifact, the team began to construct a more complete picture of the relationship between Thomas Harmon and the Wanaspi people. The objects revealed a depth of cooperation that contradicted conventional historical accounts of settler indigenous relations in the region. These items weren't merely tokens, Dr. Reed concluded. They were functional objects used in daily life by both communities. They represent a shared existence that history has largely overlooked. Walter glanced at the collection of artifacts, now arranged for documentation. So why did all evidence of this relationship disappear from historical records? What happened to the Wanaspi? Dr. Reed frowned. "That's the missing piece of our puzzle. Harmon's document doesn't explain what eventually happened, only that he feared for the future of their arrangement. We need to dig deeper into the Harmon family history." Armed with new understanding from the artifacts, Dr. Reed and Walter returned to the Millfield Historical Society. Martha Delaney helped them access the complete archives of local newspapers and private records that had been donated over the years. "We're specifically looking for information about the Harmon family after 1734, Dr. Reed explained, "and any mention, however oblique, of the Wanaspi people or unusual arrangements with indigenous groups." They spent hours sifting through fragile documents, creating a timeline of the Harmon family's presence in the region. Thomas Harmon had prospered as a landowner and merchant, eventually building a substantial estate. His children and grandchildren continued as prominent citizens, with the family's influence peaking in the mid-1800s. "Here's something interesting," Walter said, carefully turning the pages of a family Bible that had been donated to the Historical Society. Thomas Harmon lived to be nearly 90 years old, unusual for that time, and look at these margin notes. The Bible contained handwritten notes tracking family events. Several entries included cryptic references to meetings at the oak and renewing the promise. It appears the agreement continued through at least 2 generations, Dr. Reed observed, but there's no explicit mention of the Wanaspi. Martha brought them a collection of letters from the 1780s. These might be relevant. There was some controversy involving Jacob Harmon, Thomas's grandson. The letters revealed a conflict between Jacob Harmon and local authorities regarding property, boundaries, and land use. Several passages referred obliquely to inhabitants with special status on Harmon land. He was continuing his grandfather's arrangement, Dr. Reed said, but facing increased scrutiny. Further research uncovered a significant lead, a legal dispute. From 1802, between the Harmon family and another prominent local family, the Wilsons. That name came up before, Walter recalled. Herbert mentioned an old dispute between the families. The court records were incomplete, but they found a newspaper article summarizing the case. James Wilson had accused Edward Harmon of harboring persons of questionable status on his property and failing to properly register all his land for taxation. This could be referring to the Wanaspi, Dr. Reed said. By this time, any indigenous people in the area would have been expected to relocate to designated territories. The historical trail grew clearer through subsequent decades. The Harmon family gradually lost influence and wealth following the dispute with the Wilsons. By the 1850s, they had sold off significant portions of their once extensive holdings. "Look at this," Martha said, bringing them a ledger from the town records. In 1892, William Harmon donated the last major piece of family land to the town, with the specific condition that it become a public park and that the oak tree be preserved. Walter nodded slowly, maintaining the promise even as they lost control of the land. The final piece fell into place when they discovered a brief obituary from 1897. It mentioned William Harmon's passing and included an unusual line. The last. Of his line to honor ancient bonds, he ensured the sanctity of shared ground until nature itself might reveal what man has hidden. Dr. Reed read the line twice. He knew. The last Harmon knew about the box beneath the oak. This wasn't just about preserving a tree. It was about preserving the evidence of the agreement. But what happened to the Wanaspi? Walter asked. Martha brought them one final document, a fragile journal kept by a local physician in the 1820s. One entry described treating patients at the secluded settlement beyond Harmon's eastern meadow during an outbreak of fever. The physician noted that few survived, and the remaining individuals departed westward with the spring thaw. Disease, Dr. Reed said quietly, like so many indigenous communities. And the survivors likely joined larger groups moving west under government pressure. Walter glanced through the window toward Harmon Park, just visible in the distance. So the Harmons kept their promise, protecting the evidence of an agreement that had effectively ended. The discovery of the Harmon family's long-standing commitment, protecting the evidence of their agreement with the Wanaspi, raised new questions. Dr. Reed organized a return visit to the fallen oak tree site, wondering if additional artifacts might be found. The ground-penetrating radar should help us determine if anything else is buried in the vicinity, she explained as technicians set up equipment around the massive root ball of the fallen oak. Walter watched with interest. "You think there might be more?" The parchment mentions tokens of their bond, plural. "We found several objects in the container, but there are hints in the text that suggest something else might have been placed separately." The radar survey proceeded methodically, covering a grid pattern around the tree. After an hour of scanning, one of the technicians called Dr. Reed over to view the results. "There's definitely something here," he said, pointing to an anomaly on the screen. "Smaller than the container you already found, about 3 feet down and offset from the main root system. The excavation was conducted with painstaking care. University archaeology students removed soil layer by layer, screening each bucket for artifacts. By mid-afternoon, they had created a precise shaft leading down to the location of the anomaly. "I see something," said Myra, a graduate student, brushing soil away with a small brush. Metal like the other container, but much smaller. Dr. Reed joined her at the edge of the excavation. Under her guidance, Myra carefully exposed the object, a small cylindrical case about the size of a large cigar, made of the same distinctive metal as the original container. "The craftsmanship matches," Dr. Reed confirmed as they documented its position. "This was definitely created by the same hands." The small container was transported to the university lab and subjected to the same careful analysis as the larger box. CT scans revealed a tightly rolled document inside, but no additional objects. "The seal appears intact," Professor Chon noted. "Remarkable preservation, considering its age." The opening process was conducted in the environmental chamber, with the same precautions as before. Inside, they found a single rolled parchment, smaller and more concise than the detailed account in the larger container. Dr. Blackwood carefully unrolled it, revealing a document written in 2 distinct hands and 2 languages. "This appears to be the actual agreement itself," she said after preliminary examination. "Signed by both Thomas Harmon and someone identified as Askuk. Described as speaker for the Wanaspi people, the document was a formal covenant, outlining specific territories, rights, and responsibilities. Unlike the personal narrative found earlier, this was structured like a legal contract, though one that would have had no standing in colonial courts." "This is extraordinary," Dr. Reed said. "A private treaty between a European settler and an Indigenous group, created as equals." Walter studied the images of the document. "Why bury this separately from the other container?" "Insurance," Professor Chon suggested. "If one was found and destroyed, the other might survive." Dr. Reed nodded. The personal narrative was meant to explain the story and context. This document is the binding agreement itself. As they continued translating the document, Walter made an unexpected connection. The description of the boundary markers matches. The symbols on that silver pendant. It wasn't just identification. It was a map. Dr. Reed quickly compared the images. "You're right. The design elements on the pendant correspond to geographical features described here. Rivers, hills, the oak, tree itself. So someone wearing the pendant would literally be carrying a map of the agreement boundaries," Walter said. "Ingenious," Dr. Reed agreed. "Hidden in plain sight. This changes our understanding of the objects in the first container. They weren't just ceremonial. They were functional tools for maintaining the agreement. The significance of the discovery warranted broader expertise." Dr. Reed arranged a consultation with specialists from the state, university, and representatives from the State Historical Preservation Office. "We need perspectives beyond our immediate team," she explained to Walter, "particularly regarding the proper contextual understanding of the indigenous elements." The consultation was held in a conference room adjacent to the laboratory. Dr. Reed had prepared comprehensive documentation of their findings, including translations, analyses, and high-resolution images of all artifacts. Dr. Marcus Williams, a historian specializing in colonial-era indigenous relations, was the first to speak after reviewing the materials. "The existence of the Wanaspi as a distinct group isn't well documented in conventional historical records," he noted. "They were likely a splinter band from one of the larger Algonquian-speaking tribes that were being displaced during this period." Dr. Sofia Martinez, an anthropologist, added, "The artifacts show cultural elements consistent with larger Algonquian groups, but with distinctive variations. This supports the narrative of a small band developing their own practices in isolation." Walter listened attentively as the experts discussed the findings. The consensus quickly formed that the discovery was historically significant. Private agreements between settlers and indigenous groups weren't uncommon in the early colonial period. Dr. Williams explained, but documentation of such arrangements is exceedingly rare, particularly with this level of detail and physical evidence. Dr. Catherine Ironcloud, a tribal historic preservation officer invited to consult, examined the images of the artifacts with particular interest. The symbolism on these objects combines traditional elements with adaptations I haven't seen before, she observed. It's consistent with the community developing distinct practices in response to changing circumstances. The discussion turned to the historical context of the agreement. The early 1730s represented a period of transition in colonial America, with increasing pressure on indigenous lands, but before the more rigid policies that would emerge later in the century. Thomas Harmon was operating in a gray area, Dr. Williams noted. Such an arrangement wasn't explicitly illegal at that time, but it certainly went against the prevailing approach to indigenous relations. Dr. Ironcloud pointed to specific passages in the translation. What's remarkable is the evident respect in the language. This isn't framed as charity or tolerance, but as a mutual exchange between equals. The experts agreed that the discovery offered a rare window into a more complex relationship between settlers and indigenous people than was typically recorded. Colonial records overwhelmingly document conflict, displacement, or highly unequal arrangements, Dr. Martinez explained. This shows a different possibility that existed, even if briefly. Dr. Reed raised the question of the Wanaspi's eventual fate, sharing what they had learned about the disease outbreak in the 1820s. Unfortunately, that pattern was all too common, Dr. Ironcloud said. Small, isolated communities were particularly vulnerable to epidemic diseases. The survivors likely joined other groups, moving westward under increasing pressure from expansion. Before concluding, the discussion turned to the significance of the oak tree itself. The choice of a young oak. As the marker was deliberate, Dr. Williams noted, oaks can live for centuries. Thomas Harmon was thinking in generational terms, creating a living monument that would outlast him. As the consultation ended, Dr. Reed thanked the participants for their insights. This has given us a much stronger contextual framework for understanding the significance of these artifacts. Walter approached Dr. Ironcloud as the group was dispersing. What happens now? With the artifacts, I mean. She considered the question thoughtfully. That's a complex issue. These objects represent a shared history. The most important thing is that they're properly preserved and that their story is told accurately. Armed with insights from the expert consultation, Dr. Reed began the process of placing the Harmon-Wanaspi Agreement within broader historical context. She organized her findings chronologically, mapping them against known historical events of the region. The 1730s were a pivotal period in this area, she explained to Walter as they reviewed her timeline. European settlement was expanding, but hadn't yet reached the density that would come after the French and Indian War. Walter studied the timeline. So Thomas Harmon was operating in a sort of frontier zone? Exactly. The boundaries of authority were fluid. Colonial officials claimed jurisdiction, but their practical control was limited, especially in outlying areas. Dr. Reed had identified several similar cases from other regions where settlers and indigenous groups had formed localized arrangements. Most were known only through fragmentary references in journals or correspondence, none with the comprehensive documentation and physical evidence of the Harmon-Wanaspi Agreement. What makes this case particularly significant, Dr. Reed continued, is how long it persisted. Based on the Historical Society records, the arrangement continued in some form for nearly a century. The research revealed how unusual this longevity was. Most informal arrangements between settlers and indigenous communities collapsed within a generation due to changing policies, new waves of settlement, or leadership changes on both sides. The Harmon family's consistent protection of the agreement across generations is remarkable, noted Professor Chun, who had joined their discussion. especially as official policies became increasingly hostile to Indigenous autonomy. Walter pointed to a section of the timeline covering the early 1800s. This coincides with the dispute between the Harmons and the Wilsons. Do you think that was connected? Dr. Reed nodded. Almost certainly. By that time, any arrangement allowing Indigenous people to remain on private land outside of designated territories would have been highly controversial. The Wilsons may have used this as leverage against the Harmons in their dispute. The historical context also helped explain why the agreement had remained hidden. As federal and state policies toward Indigenous peoples hardened in the early 19th century, maintaining such an arrangement would have become increasingly difficult and potentially illegal. The Harmon family appears to have been caught between their commitment to the agreement and the changing legal landscape. Dr. Reed said, "The later generations found themselves protecting a promise that had become politically untenable." They discussed how the discovery altered understanding of settlement patterns in the region. Conventional histories described the area as having been cleared of Indigenous presence by the mid-1700s, with any remaining individuals having been relocated to designated territories further west. This evidence shows that wasn't entirely true, Dr. Reed said. Small groups maintained a presence, sometimes with the cooperation of sympathetic settlers, well into the 19th century. Walter considered the implications. So our standard historical narrative has gaps. History is always more complex than our simplified narratives, Professor Chun replied, especially regarding Indigenous settler relations. The dominant stories tend to emphasize either conflict or complete displacement, overlooking the messy middle ground where people negotiated their own local arrangements. Dr. Reed pulled up a modern map of Millfield and the surrounding area. Based on the boundary descriptions in the agreement, we can identify the approximate territory covered by the arrangement. The map revealed that the Wanaspi had maintained access to a wooded area with a creek, alongside several acres of arable land. The territory was designed to provide resources for a small community, while remaining relatively unobtrusive to expanding settlement. It was a pragmatic solution, Dr. Reed observed. Thomas Harmon created a structure that allowed coexistence when the official policy increasingly didn't. Walter studied the map, noting how the modern town had developed around the area. And nobody knew this history was literally under their feet all this time, until a storm knocked over exactly the right tree. Dr. Reed said with a smile, news of the discovery spread quickly through Millfield. What began as local curiosity evolved into community-wide interest as the significance of the artifacts became clear. Mayor Caroline Davis called a special town council meeting to discuss the findings and their implications. The council chambers were packed beyond capacity, with residents spilling into the hallway. Dr. Reed had been invited to present a summary of the discovery and its historical significance. The artifacts found beneath the oak in Harmon Park represent a previously undocumented chapter in our town's history, she explained to the assembled crowd. They provide evidence of a cooperative arrangement between Thomas Harmon and the Wanaspi people that lasted for generations. Walter sat in the front row, watching as community members reacted to the presentation with a mixture of fascination, pride, and occasional skepticism. After Dr. Reed finished, Mayor Davis opened the floor for public comment. The first to speak was Herbert Wilson, the elderly resident they had met at the Historical Society. "My family has been here since the beginning," he said, his voice wavering slightly with age. "We were always told the Harmons had secrets. Turns out the rumors were true, just not in the way anyone expected." Several residents expressed excitement about the historical significance, suggesting the town should celebrate this unique aspect of their heritage. Others raised questions about the proper ownership of the artifacts. Martha Delaney from the Historical Society addressed the council. The Millfield Historical Society would be honored to house these artifacts and create an educational exhibit about this important discovery. A professor from the community college supported this idea, emphasizing the educational value for local students. This discovery provides an opportunity to teach a more nuanced understanding of our local history. Not all reactions were positive. James Wilson, a descendant of the family that had feuded with the Harmons, questioned the interpretation of the findings. How do we know these objects are authentic, or that the translations are accurate? He challenged. My family's records suggest the Harmons were involved in questionable dealings. This could be an elaborate hoax. Dr. Reed addressed his concerns calmly, explaining the rigorous authentication process and the multiple experts who had verified the artifacts. The most thought-provoking comment came from a woman who identified herself as having indigenous heritage. These artifacts don't just belong to Millfield, she said. They represent a shared history that includes the descendants of the Wanaspi, wherever they may be today. Their voices should be part of this conversation. Her statement prompted thoughtful discussion about proper consultation with relevant Indigenous communities and cultural heritage. Organizations. Mayor Davis summarized the various perspectives. This discovery clearly matters to our community in multiple ways. We need to proceed thoughtfully, respecting both the historical significance and the various stakeholders involved. She proposed forming a committee to develop recommendations for the preservation and display of the artifacts, ensuring broad representation from different community perspectives. As the meeting concluded, Walter found himself surrounded by curious neighbors asking about his role in the discovery. His status had shifted from ordinary groundskeeper to someone connected to a significant historical find. I just called the university when I found something strange, he explained repeatedly. Dr. Reed and her team did the real work. Walking home, Walter reflected on how a fallen tree had unexpectedly changed his town's understanding of itself. Streets he had walked his entire life now carried additional layers of meaning, knowing that the Wanaspi had once lived alongside the early settlers here. The next morning, he found a small crowd gathered at the fallen oak in Harmon Park. People touching the exposed roots and taking photos, trying to connect physically with the history that had been revealed. With the translation of all documents complete and the analysis of the artifacts finalized, Dr. Reed assembled her team to review their comprehensive findings. The university had allocated a dedicated room for the project, with walls covered in timelines, maps, and photographs, documenting every aspect of the discovery. We now have the complete narrative, Dr. Reed began, addressing her team and Walter, who had become an unofficial member of the project. Thomas Harmon arrived in this region in 1731, purchasing land from the initial colonial claimants. Dr. Blackwood continued the story, referring to her finalized translations. Within his first year, Harmon encountered the Wanaspi group living in a secluded area of the property. Rather than reporting them to authorities or demanding their removal, he initiated peaceful contact. The translated documents revealed that Harmon's initial motivation was pragmatic. As a newcomer to the region, he recognized the value of local knowledge for surviving in an unfamiliar environment. The Wanaspi, already displaced from their original territory, sought stability and protection from further removal. What began as mutual convenience evolved into something deeper, Dr. Reed explained. When Harmon's family was struck by illness, in the winter of 1732, the Wanaspi healer provided treatments that saved his wife and children. This personal debt appears to have cemented Harmon's commitment to protecting the group. Professor Chun pointed to the timeline. By 1734, their informal arrangement had developed into the formal agreement documented in our artifacts. Harmon legally owned the entire property according to colonial law, but privately recognized the Wanaspi's right to maintain their settlement and traditional practices within specified boundaries. The agreement included specific provisions. The Wanaspi would provide guidance on local resources and assist the Harmon family when needed, while Harmon would ensure their territory remained undisturbed and would represent their interests in dealings with other settlers. The most remarkable aspect, Dr. Blackwood noted, is the explicit recognition of mutual benefit. This wasn't charity or tolerance on Harmon's part, but an acknowledgement of interdependence. Dr. Reed highlighted the section of the timeline covering subsequent generations. Thomas Harmon passed the commitment to his son, Joseph, who maintained the agreement through the increasingly difficult period of the French and Indian War, when suspicion of indigenous groups intensified. The documents showed how the arrangement adapted over time. As colonial settlement expanded, the Wanaspi became increasingly isolated, their movement more restricted. The Harmon family continued to protect them, sometimes at considerable social and political cost. By the early 1800s, the situation had become precarious, Dr. Reed continued. Edward Harmon, Thomas's grandson, faced legal challenges from the Wilson family, who suspected the arrangement and sought to use it against the Harmons in a property dispute. Walter interjected, "That explains the bad blood between the families. That persists even today." The final chapter of the story was the most poignant. The physician's journal discovered at the Historical Society confirmed that a fever epidemic struck the Wanaspi settlement around 1820, killing many members of the already small community. The survivors, reduced to just a handful of individuals, made the decision to leave with the spring, likely joining other indigenous groups being relocated westward. The Harmon family kept their promise even after the Wanaspi departed, Dr. Reed said. They maintained the secrecy of the agreement and protected the evidence buried beneath the oak tree, ensuring the story wouldn't be lost to history. The final document from William Harmon, donating the land for a public park with the specific condition that the oak be preserved, represented the last act in fulfilling the generations-long commitment. When he wrote about nature revealing what man had hidden, Dr. Reed concluded, he was acknowledging that someday the truth would come to light. He just couldn't have anticipated it would take another century, or that it would be a storm that finally exposed the secret. What began as a local discovery soon captured wider attention. A reporter from the county newspaper wrote a feature article about the artifacts, which was picked up by regional media. Within weeks, Dr. Reed was fielding calls from national news organizations and specialized publications in archaeology and history. "This is completely unexpected," she admitted to Walter as they prepared for an interview with a national science program. Academic discoveries rarely generate this level of public interest. Walter had become an unlikely minor celebrity. As the person who first discovered the artifact, he was frequently included in interviews and photo opportunities. His straightforward account of finding the object in the exposed roots resonated with audiences. "I just did what anyone would do," he explained to a television reporter. "I knew it was something important, so I called the experts." The media narrative focused on several compelling angles: the storm that revealed a centuries-old secret, the unexpected cooperation between settler and indigenous community, and the generations of Harmons who maintained the promise even after the Wanaspi had departed. Dr. Reed was careful to present the findings accurately, resisting attempts by some outlets to sensationalize the discovery. She emphasized the scholarly significance while acknowledging the human story at its core. What makes this discovery unique is not just the artifacts themselves, but the complete context they provide, she explained during a radio interview. We can trace the entire narrative from establishment of the agreement through its maintenance across generations and eventually to its conclusion. The university recognized the public relations opportunity, hosting a press conference where the research team presented their findings. The president of the university spoke about the importance of community partnerships in preserving local history. This discovery would not have been possible without the cooperation of many individuals, from Mr. Simmons, who first identified the artifact, to the Millfield Historical Society, who provided crucial contextual information. As the story spread, it attracted attention from museums and cultural institutions. The State Museum expressed interest in featuring the artifacts in a special exhibition. The Smithsonian sent a representative to evaluate the discovery for potential inclusion in their collection of early American Indigenous relations. Walter found the attention both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. During a lull between interviews, he confided in Dr. Reed, "I never expected anything like this. I'm just the groundskeeper who found a weird metal thing in some roots." She smiled. "That's exactly why people connect with this story. It reminds us that history isn't just in books and museums. Sometimes it's literally under our feet, waiting to be discovered." The media coverage had unexpected benefits for Millfield. Tourism increased as history enthusiasts visited the town to see Harmon Park and the fallen oak. Local businesses created themed products, from Harmon oak coffee blends to Wanaspi-inspired crafts of questionable authenticity. Mayor Davis leveraged the attention to promote the town's historical significance. Millfield has always valued its heritage, but this discovery adds an important dimension to our understanding of our past. Some communities would have quickly commercialized such a discovery, but Millfield maintained a relatively thoughtful approach, influenced by the ongoing discussions about proper respect for the cultural significance of the artifacts. As the initial wave of media excitement began to settle, Dr. Reed received an unexpected call. A curator from the National Museum of the Faun American Indian had read about the discovery and expressed interest in consulting on the proper contextual presentation of the artifacts. "This isn't just colonial history," the curator explained. "It's Indigenous history as well, and that perspective needs to be properly represented in whatever exhibition eventually houses these items." With multiple institutions expressing interest in the artifacts, complex questions of ownership, display rights, and ethical considerations emerged. The university convened a special committee to address these issues, including Dr. Reed, representatives from the town of Millfield, state officials, and consultants from Indigenous cultural heritage organizations. "These artifacts present unique challenges," explained Dr. Vivian Torres, an expert in museum ethics who chaired the committee. "They represent a shared history between settler and Indigenous communities, which requires thoughtful consideration of all perspectives." The initial question of legal ownership seemed straightforward. The artifacts were found on town property, making them technically the property of Millfield. However, the ethical dimensions extended beyond legal frameworks. While the legal situation is clear, we have a responsibility to consider the cultural significance of these items, Dr. Torres continued, particularly given their connection to Indigenous history. Walter attended several committee meetings as an observer. During one session, he raised a question that shifted the discussion. What would Thomas Harmon have wanted? He went to great lengths to preserve this record. What was his purpose? This perspective reframed the conversation. The documents themselves provided insight into Harmon's intentions. He had created the record to ensure the agreement would not be forgotten, that a more nuanced history would eventually come to light. The committee developed a set of guiding principles. The artifacts should remain together as a collection rather than being separated. They should be displayed with full context, including both settler and Indigenous perspectives. And they should be accessible to the public and to scholars, particularly those from Indigenous communities. An unexpected voice entered the discussion. When a historical linguist published a paper suggesting potential connections between the Wanaspi language elements and several contemporary Indigenous nations, representatives from these groups were invited to view the artifacts and contribute to the consultation process. "We cannot definitively establish direct lineage," Dr. Blackwood explained, "but there are cultural and linguistic connections that suggest shared heritage with several existing communities." These consultations added valuable perspectives. Robert Eagle, a tribal historic preservation officer for one of the potentially connected nations, examined the artifacts carefully. "These objects tell a story that challenges simplistic narratives," he observed. "They show that our ancestors sometimes found ways to coexist and adapt, even under difficult circumstances. After months of deliberation, the committee reached a consensus. The artifacts would remain the property of Millfield, but would be placed on long-term loan to the State Museum, which had the facilities to properly preserve them. The exhibition would be developed collaboratively with input from all stakeholders, including Indigenous representatives. The agreement included provisions for temporary exhibitions in Millfield and potentially at Indigenous cultural centers. It also established a research fund to support further study of the artifacts, and the history they represented. Dr. Reed was satisfied with the outcome. This approach honors the complexity of the story these artifacts tell. It recognizes that history is rarely as simple as we sometimes portray it. Walter had a more personal reaction. "I think Thomas Harmon would approve. He went to all that trouble to preserve the truth. Now everyone will have a chance to learn from it." The final plan included a specific provision that the site of the fallen oak in Harmon Park would be marked with an educational plaque, explaining its significance as the place where the historical record had been preserved for centuries. "The physical location matters," Dr. Torres explained. "This wasn't just an abstract agreement. It happened in a real place, involving real people, and that connection to the landscape remains important." As the committee concluded its work, the members recognized that they had established a potential model for handling similar discoveries, where historical artifacts represented complex cultural intersections, requiring multiple perspectives. The development of the exhibition took nearly a year of collaborative work. Before the State Museum installation, Millfield hosted a preliminary display at the Historical Society. Dr. Reed worked closely with Martha Delaney to create an exhibition that would engage the local community. "We want to tell the complete story," Dr. Reed explained during the planning process. "Not just the artifacts themselves, but the context that makes them significant." The exhibition space was transformed to guide visitors through the narrative chronologically. The entrance featured large photographs of the fallen oak and the moment of discovery, with Walter's first-hand account displayed prominently. "I wanted to honor his role," Dr. Reed told Martha. "Without his careful observation and decision to call experts, these artifacts might have been damaged or their context lost." A central display featured the artifacts themselves, carefully preserved in custom-built cases with controlled environmental conditions. Each object was presented with detailed information about its purpose and significance. The metal containers were displayed alongside high-resolution images of the documents they had protected for centuries. An interactive map showed the boundaries described in the agreement, overlaid on modern Millfield, allowing visitors to understand the geographical context of the historical arrangement. Perhaps most compelling was the section dedicated to the human story. Based on the translated documents, the exhibition included thoughtfully created illustrations depicting Thomas Harmon and the Wanaspi leader Askuk meeting beneath the young oak tree, sealing their agreement with the ceremonial objects now on display. "We were careful not to romanticize," Dr. Reed noted. "The illustrations are based on historical records of clothing and appearance from that period, not stereotypical imagery." The final section addressed the legacy of the agreement, tracing the Harmon family's continued protection of the secret through generations, even after the Wanaspi had departed. It concluded with reflection questions, asking visitors to consider what this history meant for their understanding of their community. The opening night drew a capacity crowd. Mayor Davis gave a brief speech acknowledging the significance of the discovery for Millfield's understanding of its own past. "This exhibition reminds us that history is complex, that the standard narratives sometimes miss important stories. Our town was built on land with a richer history than many of us realized." Dr. Reed observed the community's response with satisfaction. Residents moved through the exhibition engaged in thoughtful conversation, many returning to specific displays for closer examination. Children were particularly drawn to the replica game pieces. Designed based on the originals for hands-on interaction. Walter found the experience surreal. "That's my name on the wall," he remarked to Dr. Reed. "Future generations will read about how the groundskeeper found something in the roots of a fallen tree, and they'll learn about Thomas Harmon and the Wanaspi," she replied. "Their story is preserved, just as he intended." The most meaningful moment came when representatives from several indigenous nations toured the exhibition. Their perspectives had been incorporated throughout the displays, acknowledging the Wanaspi story as part of the broader indigenous history of adaptation and resilience in the face of colonization. "This is how history should be presented," commented Robert Eagle after viewing the exhibition. "Not as a single narrative, but as the complex intersection of different experiences and perspectives." After its successful run at the Millfield Historical Society, the exhibition was carefully packed for transfer to the State Museum, where it would reach a much larger audience. The artifacts themselves would eventually move to their permanent home in the State Museum's collection, but with the agreement that they would periodically return to Millfield for special exhibitions. As Walter helped carefully pack the displays, he reflected on how a chance discovery had connected him to a centuries-old story. "I never thought much about history before," he admitted to Dr. Reed. "Now I can't stop thinking about all the stories that might be hidden around us." 2 years after the storm that revealed the Harmon-Wanaspi Agreement, its impact continued to ripple through academic circles and the community of Millfield. The exhibition at the State Museum had drawn record attendance, and the artifacts had been featured in several scholarly publications. Dr. Reed had received research funding to expand the investigation, focusing on identifying similar arrangements in other early colonial settings. Her work was challenging conventional historical narratives about settler-indigenous relations in the region. The documentary evidence of cooperation doesn't negate the broader pattern of displacement, she explained during a university lecture, but it does complicate our understanding, showing that historical reality was more nuanced than simple narratives of conflict or conquest. In Millfield, the fallen oak had become a local landmark, though the tree itself had been removed for safety reasons. Its massive stump had been preserved and surrounded by an educational installation explaining its significance. Visitors regularly traced the path from the stump to the Historical Society, where a permanent local exhibition maintained the connection to the discovery. The town had embraced its expanded history. School curricula now included the story of the Harmon-Wanaspi Agreement, teaching students about this chapter of local history that had remained hidden for centuries. Walter Simmons found his role as groundskeeper subtly transformed. Visitors to Harmon Park often recognized him and asked questions about the discovery. He had developed a standard tour, showing people the preserved stump and explaining how the storm had revealed what generations had kept hidden. "People are fascinated by how random it was," he told Dr. Reed during one of her visits to Millfield. "If the storm had blown the tree in a different direction, or if the roots had broken differently, we might never have found it." The site where the oak had stood now featured a young tree, planted in a ceremony that brought together town officials, university representatives, and members of indigenous communities with potential connections to the Wanaspi. "We thought it fitting to continue the tradition," Mayor Davis had explained during the planting. "This new oak will stand as a living memorial to both the agreement itself and its rediscovery." The Wilson family, after initial skepticism, had contributed family records to the Historical Society, helping to fill in details about the property dispute that had threatened the Harmon-Wanaspi arrangement in the early 1800. This gesture of reconciliation helped heal a division that had persisted in the community for generations. Perhaps the most significant legacy was the establishment of the Harmon-Wanaspi Research Initiative, funded by grants and community contributions. The initiative supported scholarship on early settled indigenous cooperation and cultural exchange, with particular emphasis on including Indigenous researchers and perspectives. This discovery reminded us that history isn't just what's written in official records. Dr. Reed observed during a community forum. Sometimes the most revealing stories are the ones that were deliberately hidden, preserved in hope that future generations would be ready to understand them. For Walter, the legacy was more personal. He had developed a keen interest in local history, volunteering at the Historical Society and taking classes at the community college. His unique connection to the discovery had given him a new purpose. "I never thought picking up a job as a park groundskeeper would lead to all this," he reflected as he showed a group of visitors around the memorial site. "It makes you wonder what other secrets might be waiting to be discovered." On quiet evenings, Walter sometimes sat on a bench near the young oak, contemplating the strange connection across time. Thomas Harmon had buried his secret beneath a sapling, trusting that someday someone would understand its significance. Nearly 3 centuries later, that trust had been fulfilled. The storm that had knocked over the ancient oak had not just revealed artifacts. It had uncovered a story of cooperation and commitment that challenged assumptions and expanded understanding. In its own way, that legacy was still growing, like the young oak that now stood where its predecessor had fallen, roots gradually strengthening in the same soil that had preserved a hidden history for so long.